saying we are officially live. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. This is Covenant Origins. I'm your host, Jacob Ryder. We got the boys back tonight. Sam, Michael, how are you guys doing?
Great.
Doing well.
Awesome. This is going to be a different kind of episode. Normally, we react to a lot of anti-Mormon rhetoric, particularly from other Christians. Usually, we're reacting to videos or clips and things like that. As you have already seen from the thumbnail, tonight we're talking about something a little bit different. As you know, there's been a lot of heartbreak, a lot of anger, a lot of grief going on in the news surrounding the tragedy of Charlie Kirk's assassination. Anytime something like this happens, a lot of people, particularly people of religious persuasion, are asking questions like, why would God allow something like this to happen? Or like, where is God in all of this pain? Valid questions, ones that I think all people of faith wrestle with from time to time. On top of that, we've also seen a lot of commentary in online spaces. And particularly tonight, we're going to be looking at some commentary from ex-Mormon, anti-Mormon voices online, some of which tries to use the tragedy of Charlie Kirk's death as a way to sort of implicate the church and its teachings. We're going to look at some of those kind of claims and the discussion around that. But tonight, we want to take some time to kind of respond thoughtfully to some of those queries, and also maybe take a step back and look at the bigger issue here. Theologically speaking, we might refer to it as a theodicy, or the problem of evil and suffering. And we're going to talk about it from a Latter-day Saint perspective, and how that maybe differs from mainline or mainstream Christian thought. So I hope that we can keep this conversation compassionate and Christ-centered. We want to mourn with those who mourn, and also find ways to hold on to faith, hope, and charity. Um, the the big three that the Savior calls us to, in the middle of all the hurt and confusion that's going on, politically, socially in this country, and certainly now spiritually. Um, that's going to be, I think, where we can do the most good as Latter-day Saints and as people of faith, is helping others to find hope and and charity. So, with all of that, I know, Michael, you've prepared some thoughts, and Sam, if you have some thoughts and you want to jump in as well, the floor is yours, Michael. I know you got some things you'd like to say.
Yeah, so I did write this out. I never write anything for any time I join a live, but I wrote something out tonight. Um, so admittedly, Kirk was not someone I watched often. I knew who he was. I sometimes agreed with him, sometimes did not agree with him. I didn't follow him on social media. I didn't listen to his show. I didn't support his organization. Yet, like so many others I have talked with in the aftermath, I was deeply struck by three things: the assault on an innocent man, the assault on our inalienable right to speech and belief, and most of all, the disturbing reality that so many responded with celebration, victim blaming and shaming, and rationalizations for murder. What has become particularly troubling is the way some, even among fellow Latter-day Saints, are engaging in demeaning rhetoric that falsely labels others as fascists or oppressors, even in the aftermath of such an event, and in some cases, even dialing up their rhetoric. In far left or Marxist frameworks, as has been called out both before and after Kirk's murder, fascists, aka the other, are dehumanized. Along those lines, I have seen fellow church members declare that those who differ politically from them are unworthy even of salvation, inferring damnation in outer darkness. There is truly nothing more akin to dehumanizing an LDS in our doctrine than to say something so inflammatory. That spirit of condemnation runs contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I fear exposes a deep-seated hypocrisy. Ultimately, the celebratory and the excuse-making attitudes don't fulfill their intended or hopeful goals. They neither work to hurt or convert those who strive to maintain the straight and narrow course, but rather they hurt those who hold them. As Coolio sang, "Tell me, why are we so blind to see that the ones we hurt are you and me?" Or perhaps better yet, as Christ said regarding hypocrisy, "You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean." It calls to mind also the murders of Joseph and Hiram Smith. While I do not place Kirk on their same spiritual stature nor close to the same level of importance, the parallel lies in the spirit of the act. Their murderers were driven by ideological hatred toward the religious and political beliefs of their victims. It should be noted that there were those among the mob who were boastful, and as they boasted, others joined them in celebrating their satanic deeds of the day. Such a reaction to evil only further corrupts the soul and reveals a heart in danger of being wrapped about in the chains of hell. As members of the church, we covenant to remember Christ always, to remember that his atoning sacrifice was made for all, and that through him we, also being counted among the guilty, may go free like Barabbas. Yet we can only be with him and receive our robe and starry crown on condition of our obedience and faithfulness to his law. This is why we continually renew our covenants by partaking of the Lord's Supper, stating that we do so in remembrance of the body of thy Son, and witness unto thee, O God, the eternal Father, that they are willing to take upon them the name of thy Son, and always remember him and keep his commandments which he has given them, that they may always have his Spirit to be with them. Therefore, as one striving to be counted with the saints of God, it is my covenantal duty to respond differently than the world responds, to extend grace, to live the two great commandments, to speak truth, and to carry my cross along my portion, however small it is, of the Via Dolorosa in reverent humility. That I may succeed in doing so, I have been endowed with many gifts, including that I may hear and understand the word of the Lord, that I may see and correctly judge truth from error, that I may shoulder all the burdens which I will have, and to have the strength that I may defend truth, proclaim his gospel, and declare his peace. My hope is that while in this life I may be able to stand still and see the salvation of God, so that in the next life I may hear, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Christ alone bore the wounds for our sins, sorrow, grief, and suffering. Our calling is to serve him, to set aside ungodliness, to have compassion, and to defend truth and peace without surrendering the principles of righteousness. I know who prevails in the end, though I do not know how each chapter of the story unfolds. I know the outcome. Christ is victorious, and he will exalt those who are set on his right hand. So let us not abandon him by yielding to carnality, vice, or violence, nor by giving any heed to philosophies that exalt, promote, or excuse carnality and violence. The Zion people, those who will have Christ as their king, can and will only be those who are disciples of peace. So let us be peacemakers, following his ascending and exalting path. For he alone is the way, the truth, and the light. The government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace.
Wow. Thank you, Michael. I'll add my extemporaneous thoughts. It's been a week now since Charlie was assassinated. And over this past week, I've reflected on a lot of the similarities between me and Charlie. And being, yeah, a guy in his early 30s with kids and a wife, and yet, of course, with a value for free speech, freedom of religion. It's been, yeah, a a moment of grief, which has been strange, given that I, yeah, I didn't follow Charlie closely. I, of course, didn't know him personally. I don't know, even know if I knew anybody who knew him personally. That's how far removed I am from Charlie, other than a decade ago, while I was a student at Utah State, I was approached to start a chapter of Turning Point USA at Utah State. The funny thing is that at that time, I I just didn't like his vibe. I don't know. I don't know that I totally like the debate bro vibe most of the time anyways. So I didn't get involved at that point. But even so, uh, his influence on the culture was undeniable. And this past week of processing what what it means for that to have happened. Um, I'll just say nobody wakes up in the morning thinking their life is going to end that way. Unless, and this is perhaps, a bit of Stoic philosophy coming into play, unless you think that every day that could be it. And so for me, it's been a good reminder that to be prepared to meet God, there is, of course, a spiritual reflection and repentance and meditation around that. But for my wife and I, there's been practical conversations, contingency plans drawn up and thought of and discussed in frank ways that I don't think many people allow themselves to even consider. Not that I have any reason to suspect I might be targeted in the same way Charlie was, but life is precious, and in many ways it's short. In many ways it's also long, but I would just say that while there are plenty of others who have platforms, they have voices, they are activating people to radicalize, mobilize, one way or another, politically, culturally. Um, I would advise, and what I'm trying to do, at least first of all, is to prepare myself to meet God with all practical considerations. And if you're married, if you have kids, you got to think it through. You got to be ready because it's there's a non-zero chance that you'll be assassinated, but there's it can happen any which way. Nobody wakes up thinking today's going to be the day. And so you got to think that every day is going to be the day. Um, and so in that sense, I've I've tried to humble myself and allow this experience, which is of course, now we're close to what his wife Erica and his daughters and his business partners, his team, everybody around him, everybody who really knew him. In fact, uh, I was sharing with Michael and Jacob last night, Frank Turek, the well-known college campus, evangelical apologist, loves taking questions and defending Christianity that way. I didn't know this until he hosted a special Q&A that Frank was there on the stage with Charlie. Frank got in the car with Charlie as they were evacuating him. Frank was there for Charlie's last moments. And so obviously, there's varying degrees of grief and shock that we're all experiencing. There are lots of people who are uh, being flippant about it, unfortunately. But yeah, I just want to say that there's lots of ways that people are processing this event because it was so public and unexpected. Not that expecting it would make it any less shocking or terrible, but what has come about so far in this past week for me has been a lot of reflection and frank conversation with those I love. So I hope, if it hasn't yet, that it might be for you. a listener.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. It's been a weird week. I don't know quite how to describe it. Like you guys, I was not like tuned in to Charlie Kirk. I didn't follow him on social media. I would see the occasional YouTube clip or something come up, and I would watch sometimes. I knew who he was. He was at ASU campus a time or two while I was there during my undergrad some years ago, when he was younger and coming up in this sort of political pundit sphere. But I didn't really follow him closely. I liked some of what he said. I disagreed with some of what he said. Um, um, but I know people who really followed him and really watched his stuff and liked him quite a bit. As far as I can tell, um, he left an impression on a lot of people. Um, I think for me, so because maybe I didn't have the quite the connection with Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA and all that maybe some others did. I thought that might make it easier to kind of stomach the tragedy a bit, but what I found has been kind of the opposite. This whole last week and especially the few days immediately after, um, I guess maybe shock is kind of the right word for it. I don't really know how else to describe it. And the videos are horrific. If you're listening to this podcast and you have not seen the videos, um, I congratulate you. I consider you lucky. Um, you know, I wouldn't seek them out. Um, Unfortunately, with social media being the way that it is, it's not always easily avoidable, especially when some of these videos are getting, um, you know, passed around and shared by everybody. And so the second you open up Facebook or something, it's like you're going to see it immediately. And that's what happened to me. I opened up Facebook or Instagram or something, and it was right there, the first thing I saw. And I'm like, well, that's enough social media for today. Um, um, it's disheartening to see, as you mentioned, Sam, how flippant some people have been, to the point of celebration. Um, and I think tonight what we want to do is talk about some of the discussion that's been developing in the wake of Charlie's death, his murder. And because I don't want to make this a political show, this channel is not overtly political. We want to talk about the gospel of Christ. That's what I want to talk about. That's what I love talking about. I love talking about the temple. I love talking about the atonement. These are things that I love so much that I was willing to make a channel dedicated to talking about this. Um, and I don't want to dampen that by making this a cheap political punditry episode. So what I'd like to do, and Michael and Sam are here to help me because they're infinitely more knowledgeable and wise than I am. We're going to talk about the um, the discussion that's been going on online this past week and a half or so since this tragedy occurred, and how that relates to the church. to quote unquote Mormonism. So, Michael, you've gathered a handful of screenshots and things from the anti-Mormon and ex-Mormon space. And we're not going to, this isn't going to be like an exhaustive sort of thing where we're going to go through everything. But we do want to kind of highlight a few of the conversation topics and talking points that have been going around this last week and a half and how they pertain to the church and its possible implications for the alleged shooter's motives. Because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the alleged perpetrator of this horrific act and his upbringing and maybe where he became radicalized, quote unquote, into to the point that he would take another person's life. So that's where we're going to go. Michael, maybe you can kind of lay this out for us. Where did this conversation start? If we go back a week and a half, immediately after Charlie's murder, before we even knew anything about who the shooter could be, before he was identified, what were some of the earliest sort of talking points going around about potential motives and things like that as related to maybe the church?
Well, as related to the church, because it happened in Utah in, Provo Orem, right? You've used in technically Orem, but like if you know the area, you don't know if you're in Provo or Orem half the time. And so that part of Utah County is really saturated with LDS more than Salt Lake City. So you can safely say just on demographic, half the people there in attendance would have been LDS probably. Maybe more because it's a conservative event, right? Um, and then, well, by percentage and just the way people think, it's Utah. Well, we're going to get to some of these. I have images. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the church. The beliefs that people in the church can and do have that may differ from each other on various issues, right? There is no temple recommend question, for example, or baptismal interview question that requires you to vote in a certain way politically, or adhere to a certain party. We can talk about some social issues that the church takes a stand on, which are moral issues like abortion and that, which may, lead toward being more conservative than not. But that doesn't require, that you have to be affiliated to a certain party and vote in a certain way, things like that. But that is the mindset of the people who maybe don't know us, or who want to attack us baselessly. So obviously there was immediate popping off of this is probably Mormon, and then it's probably a right-wing guy. Oh, it's probably what's called a groiper. I had never heard the term groiper until this happened. And now I know groiper is apparently some far-right anti-Zionist lunatic who, the more I look at it, Nick Fuentes, the more I just see a mirror of the far, far left. You have the political horseshoe, as a lot of people call it, right? The spectrum that we live within isn't the true political spectrum, unfortunately. We kind of live in a horseshoe spectrum where the two ends that are supposedly the most diametrically opposed are actually far too much alike than anything else. And it's the people and they're like the 5 to 10% on each end, and then it's the 80% who fill up the rest of the horseshoe, but they're not trying to act in agitation toward each other the same way. Like they peacefully live and coexist just fine. And that's the way it is in the church because the church is part of the culture. And so there's extremists and extremism potentially within the church, but definitely potentially without it. Ultimately, at the end of the day, why someone would commit a murder, we have denounced murder, I think, specifically 3 times in Doctrine and Covenants as the one and only way you lose Christ's grace from this life for good. Um, once you become a member of the covenant, that is. And so, we can't condemn it in any stronger terms than that, because we can't be the final judge of exactly where they fall. But our scripture in 76 does say that they're celestial being at that point, and have lost the crown that they could have received. So, it certainly can't be LDS doctrine that leads someone to this. In terms of, and that's why, within the spectrum of belief, ideological beliefs, political beliefs, um, you're not going to find any kind of general LDS member assenting to this. What you're going to find is perhaps some of the very extreme, um, who might, right? Who allow the gospel to be led by their politics or what have you, or other ideologies, and they just think the gospel is something that they can morph into it or something like that. Um, and so only by trying to create some kind of a straw man based off of really poor examples could you claim that the LDS have, a part to play in this, obviously. Um, but and I can share some of the screenshots. I have 6 of them that I
Yeah,
picked out of
there are
many.
some examples
Yeah,
that people have tried to bring up
yeah,
to imply that you could make a case that under a specific lens you might be able to um you might be able to show that Latter-day Saint beliefs could lead a person to this.
yeah,
But I think those are pretty weak.
yeah.
Um, but anyways, yeah. So um, walk us through a couple of these screenshots here.
Yeah, so the first one, I blurred out most people, but Mark Driscoll's too public of anti-Mormon guy. I'm not blurring out his name. He's got way more than this that he's been saying. Um, I do got to give a shout out to the guys over at Porch Time. They actually sent me all these screenshots, and probably 4 times more than we're going to show here. I have 6 that I picked out. Um, and if you don't know Porch Time, they're actually a couple of agnostic dudes, primarily Chris Hanna, who did leave the LDS faith, but they actually kind of have a funny outlook on it. They try to encourage people to stay within the church, and so we're associated to it in a good way, as they have remained, and not to become extremists as they deconstruct faith and ideology. I think that's their main goal, is to help prevent extremism. Um, but anyway, so we got Mark Driscoll here. Um, this is why Mormons can't be Christian, basically. They're demonic because he's a Mormon. I don't know exactly when this was posted. I got these gathered up a couple days ago, so this could have been posted the day after, the day of. I don't know, right? When this was grabbed and when it was exactly posted. Um, so I don't know if he's changed his tune. I know that they sent me several more screenshots, though, of things he said that are of this type. Um, so we go next. This one might be hard to see, but it says another blood with blood misspelled sacrificed by a death cult. Um, we see anti-Mormons talk about Christianity generally as a death cult because Christ was sacrificed, right? It is a blood sacrifice, and they think that that's very pagan and weird. Um, but they specifically call the LDS a death cult. This is a political meme. This meme was not being shared by anti-Mormons. This meme was being shared by leftists online. It was used by an anti-Mormon in an anti-Mormon space to share it. And so again, I blur the people out if they're not public figures. So we're not going to try to expose them for the space or anything like that. But down here it says call to activism. Anyway, um, all right, this one was shared on a very popular Democrat page. Someone tried to tell me it's run by the Chinese. I don't know. I don't care if it's run by Chinese bots. It has hundreds of thousands of followers. They can't all be bots. It can't be that far. There's thousands of shares of this particular meme. And this user was saying, this kid is from my hometown, went to my high school, deeply Mormon, more than alt-right. Whatever that's supposed to mean, I don't know. But they're making political implications upon any member of the church having to be some kind of rather extreme fascist or something. Shout out to Stephen Smoot, by the way, for proving definitively that the Nazi Party considered the LDS Church to be anti-fascist in the 1930s and put us under specific restrictions, and was spying on the church rather heavily. You can check out his work through Mormon or through some independent stuff that he's published, but Mormoner is a good spot to go. Anyway, cis, straight, white, conservative, follower of Nick Fuentes, that's been disproven as well. Stop it already. Well, obviously, Nick Fuentes is not a good man. I'm not saying this is a good man. I'm just saying the shooter, the alleged shooter, was not a follower of Nick Fuentes. This one was a comment under one of my friends' things because shortly after his killing was 9/11. 9/11 is also obviously the World Trade Centers and Mountain Meadow Massacre. And so this individual had made a beautiful post, kind of talking about all three issues and the raging hate that happens in people's hearts that leads them to do such things, and the cultural influence of them, and blah blah blah. And this person figured it was a-okay to talk about how Charlie Kirk dehumanized others, and he seemingly deserved it for the dehumanization in which he engaged of the others, which ironically the communists who call for fascists to die by the millions would be the dehumanizers. We can't find a statement from Charlie Kirk doing that for anybody in any case. So yeah. Tyler Robinson allegedly looked up to Nick Fuentes. Again, that's been disproven in his hateful groypers. Again, a groyper is basically someone that follows Nick Fuentes, is extreme far right, white nationalist types. Did LDS theology radicalize him? Was he a hypothetical Laban? This is an ex-Mormon space, by the way. So it's an ex-Mormon page. And tries to connect Nephi killing Laban to why a Mormon would think it's okay to kill Charlie Kirk. And that he has to be right-wing for being Mormon, right? What's funny is this is an ex-Mormon posting it as not even thinking that with Tyler having himself been an ex-Mormon, what if this guy were to be accused, credibly or not, of such a horrific crime? Would it be okay for him to have his former association to the church brought in and have them say, oh, well, because you're Mormon, so and so? It's just weird. It makes no sense. But this is the type of rhetoric. I have, like I said, a lot more screenshots, and I didn't even get the worst ones sent to me because a lot of them have a lot of language. And so ones I got that had language I'm not showing, and there were many more that I just didn't want. This one here, Mormon discussion, it's Bill Real, right? RFM maybe. I don't know. I haven't watched it. A lot of times RFM joins him. But what I asked about it, so I didn't have to watch it, and I was told he did the Nephi to Laban thing corollary again, and trying to weave it into, yeah, Mormonism thinks that these kinds of murders are okay because they can justify it via this means. Again, I didn't watch it. I'm going off what I was told, so this is what I heard. If I ever do watch it, I guess I'll know for sure, but I don't like to give them my time, and I don't need the algorithm to think I care. So I believe that's the last one, but there were two other videos as well, at least. So I went to, I think it was Perplexity AI, and I asked it. I think I still have it. I screenshotted it because I try to clear my tabs. How many videos have been made? Yeah, here it is. So there's this one from Bill Real on Mormon discussions. Then there's a show called Mormonism After Dark, the Charlie Kirk assassination, a late night discussion show episode from Next Mormon Podcast Network, dissecting the shootings, Mormon ties through the lens of church culture, his upbringing, his political religious overlap, speculates on whether doctrines of obedience and anti-evangelical sentiments, because of Charlie Kirk's beliefs, could have indirectly fueled the attack. There's a third video then. This is from Black. It says, what does it say? Black pastors spread lies about Charlie Kirk after his assassination. This is from a conservative Christian commentary channel. And it seems to be trying to point out how some Black religious leaders are trying to downplay the Mormon angle in media and such. And so, like, good on the Black pastors. But since the title is Black Pastors Spread Lies, the implication of the video seems to be that they should be pumping it up instead. So it's not against the Black pastors, that is pro the Black pastors. They score major points for being anti-violence, apparently, but whoever made that video doesn't agree that they should have been allowed to. So that's the ones I'm going to share, and some of the commentary I can have on it right now. But yeah, just as far as what we're seeing in the space, a lot of people have seen probably just as bad and worse. And if you're trying to seek it out, you're going to see much worse than what I displayed there. So
yeah, unfortunately, I've seen far too much in the last week or so. Not just people celebrating or being flippant, as we mentioned earlier, but calls for more violence. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that particularly, but there are a lot of people online who they're engaged in sort of rounding up information about the particular individuals and their social media accounts of people who are making calls to violence and things like that, and are they're sending those those tweets or those posts and things to their employers and things like that. There's a lot of that kind of going on right now as well. We just saw in the last 24 hours or so the cancellation of a popular late night show. Well, depending on how popular, I guess is relative.
yeah.
So we've seen a number of incidents over the last week or so of people actually experiencing the ramifications of the discourse online. And if you fall too far on the flippant side or the celebratory side of this tragedy, a lot of people are losing their jobs. They're being fired. They're losing friendships, and that it's going both ways. I'm not saying it's all coming from one direction, but there's a lot of that going on right now that, in my estimation, in the long run, will be a net negative in terms of how we communicate with each other across the aisle, so to speak, in our political discourse. One thing that I find interesting is that for a very long time, we've sort of seen this quote unquote cancel culture, particularly coming from the political left aimed at the political right. Or just anybody who says anything that they deem reprehensible is worthy of cancellation in some degree or another. And we've seen that for a long time, and I think we've I don't know that we've gotten used to it, but I think maybe over the last however many years of that kind of going on, it's sort of died out a little bit. I haven't seen a ton of that going on the last few years. And now with this tragedy surrounding Charlie Kirk, we're seeing that same that same rhetoric, that same application of cancel culture now coming from the political right aimed at the political left or anybody that says something that they deem reprehensible. Now, granted, direct calls for violence or anything like of that nature is reprehensible, is disgusting, is dehumanizing, and ought to stop. And depending on the severity, can be illegal, and um, and so the legal ramifications of calls for violence and things like that on our public square, I think need to be dealt with appropriately. And as much as it disgusts me to hear someone or see someone post about how happy they are over this horrific tragedy, I'm still not in favor of shutting them up and uh trying to get them fired from their job and things of that nature. I've been very conservative politically for the majority of my adult life. Um, and I, without getting into any specifics here, one thing that has always been kind of a standard or an ideal for me is free speech. I think people should be able to say disgusting, horrific things if they want to say them, uh, without fear of uh, violence or some other um, uh, recourse of that nature. Barring, of course, obviously doing or saying something illegal. Um, I'm going to defend the people momentarily who are saying nasty things online, both ways. Um, Not just people who are talking positively about Charlie Kirk's death, but people on the other side who are going after those people as well are also saying some nasty things and doing some nasty things. So we're seeing it going both ways here. And where I think a lot of the cancel culture had waned in the last few years, this last week and a half has taught me that it can come back in a hurry.
Mm-hmm.
And that is terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
I I don't know really what to make of all this. Personally, I don't have answers. Um, and maybe without getting too far into that conversation, um, do you guys have any thoughts about all that's been going on in our
I
public
mean,
discourse, and how have you guys been handling a lot of that?
I don't like the cancel culture vibe. I've spoken out more than once, usually in groups or whatever, that these like lists that people are putting together are incredibly dangerous. There's no need for them to make it so public and put up websites and have lists. If they have a concern about a particular individual for a very specific reason, they could take it up with the employer for that reason and have that kind of dialogue, or with the individual. And I think it should be limited to specific things. I don't like teachers who have access to your or my children to teach them when they're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old to hate their parents through their political messaging that they might have in the classroom. And I would want to raise a hand and say, hey, you're saying this online. You have a right to free speech there. You can't be telling my kid to hate me. Are you doing that in class? And I would interrogate my child. And I want to know what the kids would say that their teacher is telling them. And I think that that's proper ramification. I think there's a proper way to go about it. I do not like the cancel culture of lists and public shaming like that. Um, so certain cases, I agree that they need to be looked into, investigated, however it is. And because they're in trusted positions with a lot of power and authority over very vulnerable people, children, there's some places where their speech needs to be properly limited to the audience in an appropriate manner. We don't want them talking about sexuality and stuff with them at those ages either. Talking about political violence or political themes and messaging doesn't have place. And so I've kind of made the argument that like I really hate it, the cancel culture stuff. I do not like it. If people have concerns, they should take it up individually. They should be able to do that, and they should have the wherewithal to do that. Doing hit lists, well, I shouldn't call it a hit list. That's probably way too inflammatory. Doing lists is completely out of bounds.
Yeah, like databases
Yeah, it's
with
just so
posts
disgusting,
from
vile, and
people's
wrong.
accounts and stuff.
Like,
Yeah.
especially because it doesn't extend grace to the individual. They're not good. What if they want to repent, change, and are truly solemn about it and will never really do that again, and they learn their lesson? They're now forever in the database.
Yeah. I agree with you. I'm not in favor of just compiling lists of people and their accounts and the things that they say. Because that's a very slippery slope.
Hmm.
Um, so, but as I mentioned before, there are plenty of accounts of people who are actually calling for violence.
Hmm.
They're being more inflammatory. They're trying to raise the temperature, and they're calling for violence on other conservatives. They're calling for violence on Charlie Kirk's wife and children. I mean, I've I've read some really horrific posts this week. Posts that make you sick
Hmm.
to your stomach. Those need to be dealt with appropriately.
Hmm.
Adding them to some random website database is probably not the way to go.
No.
So maybe let's kind of get back into the main meat of our conversation tonight and bring this a little bit back to the screenshots that you shared with us and some of the arguments that people are making or have made this past week with regard to Charlie Kirk's shooter or alleged shooter, and maybe where we can, let's offer some commentary and maybe some rebuttals here. A couple of the big ones. So obviously, right off the top, you have the Mark Driscolls of the world that are just quite ignorant and just paint with a very broad brush. Utah equals Mormon equals conservative equals bad. And it doesn't go much deeper within that with some people. We could spend hours just kind of trying to whittle that down. So maybe let's talk about some more specific things. So one of the screenshots you shared and a couple of the things that I've seen online also will point out things like First Nephi with Nephi killing Laban. They'll point out things like the Mountain Meadows massacre, and maybe a few other events from church history as a means of sort of implicating the church and its history and teachings as being sort of a a foundation that will lead a person to eventually become violent, or if followed to its logical conclusion, Mormonism will lead to extremism, is kind of how I've seen it put.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you guys want to start with this? There's a couple examples there. How do you guys want to tackle some of this?
Well, like, okay, so unless the shooter is going to say that an angel appeared to him and against everything that he believed and felt, convinced him to kill Charlie Kirk, Nothing about Nephi's actions is used to justify such extremism. Um, Nothing about Mountain Meadows Massacre justifies it. People need to actually study the history and not watch TV shows, because there's been a couple TV shows now that depict Brigham Young as the mastermind behind it, against everything that we historically know as fact, which proves that he prosecuted it as hard as he could, and was severely distraught and in all the proper ways, angered, saddened, by it. So, I mean, people are going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to run with false narratives. And that's the danger of not telling the truth, of purposefully lying, of creating a culture where it's been okay to lie and just be proud and loud about it. Like I referenced, there's been a couple of shows depicting Brigham Young and the Mormons as just these extremist, violent thugs who deserved every bit of oppression and repression that came their way, between the 1830s, and 1840s, until they left, and then the continued pressures, right? Um, uh, and thank goodness for the few individuals that weren't LDS that stood up for us and protected us. So, a few army captains and generals and things like that, that the Spirit worked upon it just enough to make sure that the saints were kept safe, in most dire need times. And so that you, we have to be able to speak out against those lies. Again, people have free speech. I'm not going to sit here and say they're not allowed to spread them, but people need to be actually critical in their thinking. There's this idea that deconstruction, it's all the rage. Oh, I deconstructed my faith. I'm deconstructing my ideology. Yeah, deconstruction's great. Except if you're not deconstructing your deconstruction, you're lying to yourself. All you're doing is you're propping up your ego. Because what you're doing is you're saying, clearly, I am the most moral, correct person that has ever lived. Therefore, my presuppositions, the way I think, is by far the most correct way to view anything and the only lens by which I should ever view it. And so I'm going to deconstruct that based on what I currently see and feel, mostly feel, is true. And therefore, they throw away so much that would be good if they could just actually instead turn that focus inside. In psychology, we would say, doing the shadow work, or, doing the integrated family systems work, integrate these parts of ourselves to overwhelm them with the good, understand ourselves and our propensities for doing wrong, right? That's the Christian call. We're supposed to understand when we're off path and correct ourselves. We're not supposed to understand there's never a possibility for me to be off path, and everything that I do must be affirmed as right and correct, and therefore they're all wrong and they're all wrong, and so on. And that's the way of the world. And if more people would just investigate the claims being made in outlandish, Hollywood shows, movies, and things, or people online and all that. I know some do. Some actually become converted because of the anti-Mormonism and the hate and all of that. So I'm not saying nobody ever does. It actually gins up interest, surprisingly, to some degree, but it blinds and confuses far too many others. And it's willful in a lot of cases. These are willful lies. Um, so I guess that's what I have to say. Sam, what do you have to say? I kind of touched on some psychology. You can go further than me there.
Sure. What, well, there there's a lot of strings out here now in the
I'm sorry.
conversation, but what's come up for me earlier today, I was actually impressed to listen to the first couple chapters of Alma. And for those of you familiar with the Book of Mormon, there's some key happenings in these first few chapters of that book. One in particular, I'll share just an excerpt in the first chapter. In verse 21, it says, "Now there was a strict law among the people of the church that there should not any man belonging to the church arise and persecute those that did not belong to the church, and that there should be no persecution among themselves. Nevertheless, there were many among them who began to be proud, and began to contend warmly with their adversaries, even unto blows. Yea, they would smite one another with their fists. Now this was in the second year of the reign of Alma, and it was a cause of much affliction to the church. Yea, it was a cause of much trial to the church. For the hearts of many were hardened, and their names were blotted out, that they were remembered no more among the people of God. And also many withdrew themselves from among them. Now this was a great trial to those who did stand fast in the faith. And while I was listening to that, I was I was imagining filling in a lot of the gaps. Obviously, the record that we have brushes over, I would obviously would be the lives of hundreds and thousands of real people that lived through a time of political, cultural turmoil, much as we're living through it in our own way now. And so when I see people processing their grief of losing a friend or a fellow political comrade, as it were, and the way they do it is by getting in front of the camera and saying, now the fight's really begun. It's only just beginning. We're never gonna let Charlie's legacy die. Like they the infamous unspeakable they are gonna pay for this. And I think it's easy for whatever side of the aisle you're on any issue to speak of the they that are holding you back and making the world unsafe and less happy overall, making it violent. And it's easy to let cancel culture become, yeah, the next Red Scare or the next war on terror. It's I'm not saying it's exactly like any of those things, but they're in every generation and in every place in history. These are just patterns of how humans interact with each other when we are prideful. And it's not to say that I'm saying they're the ones being prideful and I'm the one that's being humble and on the right side of history, right? That's part of the symptom. In fact, Elder Bednar gave a talk recently at General Conference about if you think you're the one that's above pridefulness, that's probably a surefire way to know that you're not above it and you need to humble yourself. And I think that's true. And so individually, as families, as uh, neighborhoods, communities, and as ward families, church communities, I think, yeah, again, it can be really easy to get swept up in grief, reaction, and the emotion of what's been going on and what other voices are saying about what we should do and how we should feel about these things. It may all be very natural. It may be persuasive, but I'm trying to be very cautious about the voices I'm listening to because while it can help to have people to commiserate with, uh, people to feel grief and experience that with together, understand that they're, even if it's in the best of intentions, there are people who are using this for their gain.
Yeah, there's a lot of manipulation, emotional manipulation going on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I like the way you put it, commiserating with those who are commiserating.
Yeah.
There's the I don't know if so there seems to be, at least maybe in the language, uh an implication there that is in opposition but may on the surface look similar to mourning with those who mourn. In the scriptures, we have in several places this sort of idea that a covenant people people who love God, who love Christ, and want to be God's people will mourn with each other, mourn with those that mourn. And maybe it's just the way that you said that a minute ago made me think of this, but there seems to be a difference between mourning with those who mourn in a Christ-like, loving way, experiencing grief with those who are experiencing grief, but reaching down to pull each other up, versus sort of wallowing in the mire, commiserating together, and dwelling on this grief in a healthy way, that is intentionally, in some cases, emotionally manipulative and charged and inflammatory. There's enough voices out there right now in the political sphere and the social commentary sphere that are, generally speaking, reasonable voices. But in the aftermath of some tragedy like what we've seen this last week, have taken to commiserating with each other to the point of becoming inflammatory themselves. And so it's been weird to see. And I mentioned kind of at the top of this discussion, I don't follow Turning Point USA or any of their socials. I didn't follow Charlie Kirk very closely, though I knew who he was. I had seen many of his videos from time to time. Because of that, I also will see a number of other political commentators, kind of on all sides of the spectrum, the political spectrum in the United States. There's the Daily Wires. There's the there's the Nick Fuentes types out there. There's and then on the other side of the spectrum, you have your Cenk Uyghurs and a number of other people, the Young Turks and some other groups who are kind of doing the same thing, but from the opposite political end of the spectrum. And it's been disheartening to see how many of these voices, who are normally fairly level-headed, just become engulfed in this sort of dumpster fire of online discourse right now. And I realized a few days after, because we had the shooting on the 10th. The 11th was 9/11. So in the US, that obviously brings up a lot of memories for a lot of people. It's a rather somber day for a lot of us. So it was a good few days of kind of just feeling down in the dumps a bit. And I realized after those first few days and going into the last weekend, if I tuned in and started listening to some of these political commentators report on the news of the ongoing search for the shooter, oh, we caught him, or we caught the alleged shooter, now we're going to interrogate and find out more about him and all this stuff, as you were sort of, as we were following the story as it's unfolding, I noticed the more closely I was following it and listening to these political pundits, the more I felt myself getting worked up and upset and even angry at times, to the point that after having conversations with my brother and other family members over the weekend, I have stepped aside. I have not watched any real political commentary from anybody this whole week. And it's kept me out of the loop a little bit on some of the details of what's going on. And I pick up some of the things here along the way from social media and whatever, and talking to you guys, obviously, but it's been refreshing, and it's been it's enabled me to kind of reflect on what effect does listening to some of these voices online have on me and how I feel and internalize the events of the day. Are these voices making me more angry and upset at my neighbor? Uh, and how do I deal with that? And so for me, there was almost kind of like a little wake up call last week where I started to realize uh, that if I kept listening to some of these voices, I'm going to be increasingly more upset and angry at what happened, how it's been received in the public sphere, how it's been discussed in the public sphere, um, to the point that uh, I might start to hold some real resentment towards individuals or groups. That's not healthy. Um, and so I'd like to say that that was kind of a little bit of a mini wake up call this weekend, that I was able to kind of break out of that cycle. And I haven't been back to listen to much politics this week, and I'm feeling much better because of it. But it goes back to everything you just talked about, Sam. The psychology of how it feels and what it means for somebody to experience something tragic, and what do we do to deal with it and to grieve. And does that mean that we group up and commiserate together and wallow together and um you know
Sackcloth and ashes.
yeah, yeah, or do we reach down and pick each other up and try to serve? um
Can I interject here
yeah,
for
yeah, please do.
Brene Brown talks about this, and if you don't know who Brene Brown is, she isn't a clinical psychologist. She is a research psychologist, who herself goes to a therapist for psychologists, as she likes to say. But anyway, um, and so she's compiled a lot of data, and the big thing she's known for is talking about vulnerability, the power of vulnerability. But she doesn't limit herself to just that. And she talks also about the differences, like what Sam brought up and what you were talking about. There's the way she puts it. I don't agree with the framing, and I could reframe, but I'll use her words. There's sympathy, commiseration, and empathy. Um, I would say there's sympathy, commiseration, and compassion, because empathy is really very difficult for us to have with another person. It takes a connection that the spirit has to formulate, in my opinion. That's how I look at it, just because I can't really know how Jacob and Sam really truly feel and what they've experienced. I can only have compassion for it and seek to understand, right? But that's my view. So sympathy, commiseration, empathy, or compassion. And sympathy, and so there's a cartoon that she put out years ago now. It's been a long time. But the little animal cartoon, and there's a guy down in a hole, but there's a ladder. He could get himself out, but he's sitting in the hole. He has one friend come up, and he's like eating a sandwich or something, the way I remember it. It's like, "Hey, bud, how you doing?" And the guy's like, "Oh, whatever, I'm okay." "Okay, cool. Well, let me know if you need anything." He walks away. That's sympathy in this paradigm. Second frame would be someone comes, they come down into the hole, they sit with him. "Hey, man, what's going on?" Like, wants to know, but it becomes commiserating because they don't help him get out. There's no reaching down to pull him up. Um, it's true that we should mourn with those who mourn and seek to sit with them in their space, but the other thing about it is we are to help them to receive what's called the oil of gladness, right? The joy that's on the other side of mourning. And we do that through Christ, right? So we don't just sit there and commiserate. And the third would be then that compassion or empathy where, "Hey, bud, what's going on? I'm here with you. But you know what? I'm going to help you. I'm actually going to help you overcome and resolve it. And that ladder is right there. And we're going to go up it as slow or fast as you want when we can, right? And we're going to get out of here." And so, psychologically, there's a lot there. people know this stuff, whether or not they know how to live it and exhibit it and all of that stuff is a different story. Um, but it's think about with your children, how would you respond to them when they're suffering? Would you open their bedroom door? Hey, bud, how are you? Cool, bye, and then close the door? Would you go sit on their bed, but reinforce the negative thoughts and feelings they're having? I can't imagine that either, right? Um, and so we have to be willing and able to do that with other people. And I know it's hard because a lot of people don't want to open up, or the way that they want to open up is in very public ways, and that's why we might see public commentary, right? But then if you try to do one-on-one reach out, they just shun you. So did they really want that reach out? But you can't retreat, you can't stop, can't let them shun you into non-existence of that friendship and that reason that you want to reach out. Um, so it's hard. But this is, yeah, I've been saying it in my ward for a while now. I think ministering is the greatest calling that we have. It's the most important calling that we have in the church, and everyone, if your ward's on top of it, should have a ministering assignment, and people assigned to minister to you. And the reason I say it's the greatest is because it's the responsibility that's given to everybody. So clearly it must be that important that it is spread and shared by everybody. It can't be done by a person or a presidency of people. And if we're all called to that work, there can be nothing more important. That's my view. And so yeah, that's a lot of it. And I just hope for the sake of bringing more unity in the body of Christ within the church, we're able to do more of that. Um, I also just hope generally in society we're able to do more of that. Um, on the other end, to some of the things you guys are saying, like Tim Pool's a commentator I listen to here and there. I've tried to tune him out more this last week because he was friends with Charlie Kirk and he's being inflammatory. And I hope he rebounds because I just turned him off. I've turned off a couple of the things, but some of the stuff he said um, stands out, even though he's being part of the inflammatory go get him cancel culture mob. Um, and he's said like he has friends that he grew up with. He's from Chicago, urban neighborhood. So like some of the friends that he grew up with, they've had to sever ties, which I think sucks, but because they've been celebratory and all this stuff over the Charlie Kirk thing. And he's like, I can't reason with them. I try being the nice guy, and then they're just continuing to spread it. Um, I don't think that's the right move. Like I said, I'm kind of not condemning necessarily, but I'm discerning incorrect action on Tim's part by severing ties with these people. You can't do that, in my opinion. You have like they have to actually abuse you and be heinous about it, in my opinion, for that to be a correct course of action. But that's what people are doing to cope. Coping's not always the best thing. We move through grief. We have the 5 stages, right? Um, I just wish people could pause, breathe, do what you said, Jacob, and think about it a little bit more, right? Anytime where you're thinking about shaming and blaming someone, causing them to feel that they're othered, um, purposefully intending to soothe yourself by lashing out, that's a reason to pause. You have to catch yourself. You just have to learn how to do it. Um, if you find offense in what isn't supposed to be offensive, pause. The person probably didn't mean to offend you, right? Like, try to seek to understand. Steelman what they're trying to say. Agree with them if they're right about something. Seek to build whatever bridge you can and maintain it. Um, yeah. So if we just, yes, sit stuck and commiserating, It ain't good. If we just do the performative sympathy, it ain't good.
Yeah. One thing that's been on my mind this past week is how I don't know if any of you or any of the listeners now were able to tune in for Charlie's wife's first public address after his assassination. And she spoke for, I think, maybe 15, 20 minutes. And she did it from his studio desk, just their regular studio. And what a legacy to leave. All the people that he met, he influenced, and I'm sure all of the people coming out of the woodworks wanting to give everything to her and her kids after Charlie's gone. And what a wonderful thing that is. But I think how I'm just imagining like she's making funeral plans. She's making executive decisions about the remains of her husband. Has she's on the road, and back at home she has a house full of his clothes and belongings. And there's going to be decisions to be made about how to process those things. And she has little kids that I think their oldest is 3 or something like that. So 15 years from now, there's going to be a high school graduate who never really knew her dad, but everyone who knew her dad will be reminding her how great or infamous, I suppose, uh, they knew him to be. And it's just all of these mundane but truly existential realities that humble me. And I prayerfully want to let that kind of contemplation, not that I have any need to know or any actual insight into uh, Mrs. Kirk's life, but just the exercise of contemplating and imagining, like what might that be like for her? What could that possibly be like if I were in that position? Either if I was Charlie or imagining what it would be like for my wife to experience something like that, suddenly bereaved. And I think it's being willing to go to that place. Not that it would ever match the actual experience, but simply the exercise of, okay, walk through what what might that feel like? What might the reality of that end up looking like? If and again, it doesn't have to be exact to what happened with Charlie, but sudden loss in whatever way that might be. That's what I think is a an antidote to pride and ultimately I think it's delusion. I think people delude themselves through anger and fear and grief. I think it's all emotions, it's all heightened emotions, bigger than we know how to deal with most of the time. And it's not that any of it's unjustified. It's just how we choose to express it that be can be unjustified or be healthier in other ways. And so again, thinking about the people of Alma, how so many of them chose to harden their hearts, chose to be prideful, chose to fight amongst themselves with a war of ideas, but also with their fists. They were like they were having fights in the pews, as it were. I think we have to be very careful and try to be aware and not second guess ourselves, but to truly be introspective in asking frequently, am I deluding myself? Is this pride that is leading me towards this outlook, this inclination? Like Jacob, you were saying, if I listen to too much punditry, yeah, I get activated. I feel like, yes, you are speaking to my personal values, and you've persuaded me that they've been attacked. And so I need to do something about that. And I think, yeah, there's obviously there's room for activism, uh, and there's better ways to do it than other ways. But again, my concern is, are we being led by the Spirit, or are we being led by those who stand to gain from our activation? And that to me is where I get very wary.
That's the idea. You got to deconstruct the tools of your deconstruction that I was talking about. You, if you don't, all you do is feed into your ego. Because a lot of these people, they could deconstruct all day. It's easy to destroy something. But what does it take to actually build something? And why would you purposefully throw away a good foundation that you have all kinds of evidence, testimony, and support to remain firm with because it's easy, or because it feels like maybe it isn't easy, but that, it's Elder Uchtdorf's doubt your doubts in a way. In a way. Now he's saying doubt your doubts when it comes to faith questions or historical questions or what have you. But anything that turns you into an accuser, anything that turns you into a shamer, a blamer, that's not coming from a healthy place. You could speak the truth. You could say this is reality, but you don't have to become inflammatory and you don't have to add to the truth, subtract from the truth, or anything like that. It's like someone was telling Jeremy Goff today. We all know who Jeremy Goff is. Go Goff. That he needs to shut up talking about the issues of sexuality and transgenderism. And he had a good response, and I added a response there too. But the problem isn't that people need to shut up about it. If we shut up about it, the resolution will never happen. People who transition their gender continue to actually suffer worse psychological outcomes. The affirmation doesn't work. We now know this. There are studies and it's become empirically evidenced. That's why so many European nations have stopped allowing it for children. They're even making laws to disallow it for people up to the age of 25. Certain nations. And we're sitting here saying you just need to not talk about it and we need to affirm. And that's really problematic because these people are people that need help. They're hurting. They have mental illness, not disease, mental illness. These are things that could be helped. They don't require medications. They just require being told the truth and having someone to sit with them in empathy or compassion and help them get through it and out the other side safely. And because the goal is to reduce suicidality, the goal is to reduce suffering and harm, the goal is to create happier, healthier people who are correctly functioning in society. And so if we stop talking about the truth and sharing it, and if we stop saying that here's the way that we can actually start to treat and resolve the issues of gender dysphoria that's being experienced, then we're literally becoming apathetic tools of the accuser who's going to increase the level of suffering. There's a great quote from Elder Bednar. I wrote it down 2 weeks ago. I didn't know it would come in handy, but I have it on my desk on a note. It says idleness, laziness, slothfulness, fear, apathy, and procrastination are the opposites of true faith in the Savior. Again, that's Elder Bednar. we should never think that the right thing to do is nothing unless God has told us to stand and be still. Although be still doesn't in the Greek, and Jacob, you know more of this than me, doesn't necessitate that you do nothing. I was reading about that on Robert Boylan's blog, but um, to be still is still action, but it's action that's spirit-led, basically. Um, it has different connotations in context in the Greek, but the point is, it's how we do it. Are we compassionate in doing the thing, or empathetic, whatever word you want to use there? And because, okay, so I don't know if you guys have ever read Men of La Mancha or seen Don Quixote, like the musical or anything. You guys know? Yes? No?
I've I've heard Motab sing The
Sing
Impossible
some of the
Dream.
songs, The Impossible Dream. Okay. Okay, so the story is that an old rich man kind of becomes disillusioned with society, but illusioned with the glory of former years and knighthood chivalry. Decides he's going to be a knight and go out and practice the code of chivalry. And he makes it about 2 miles from his home, um, has a fight with a windmill, and then stays at an inn that he thinks is a castle. And but and he does some good things. He inspires some people along the way, even though he's in this madness, technically, this illusionary state. He has a son-in-law who's a doctor of the time who tries to convince him of the error of his illusion. And it is an error, technically speaking, but the way he goes about it is cruel. And ultimately, he does wake him up out of it toward the end, like right after the climactic point, and you know, he comes to realize, though, yes, he was living an illusionary life, but he touched the lives of these other people, and he ends up dying anyway, just being an old man. Um, but he had touched the lives of these people, and it's powerful story, and that song is a great song, by the way, in the lyrics. But we don't want to live in a state of illusion. We can't have that. That's not correct. Even though he's the hero of the story. But we can't be unsympathetic, uncompassionate in our work to disillusion people either. Um, and it's a classic for a reason, guys. Um, and then Don Quixote is the play version, just speeds up the ability to understand the story. But that one is, I think, kind of apropos when we want to think about how can we go about these things, because all he had to do was, instead of pretending to be a knight, he was a wealthy man in a province that had a lot of suffering people, a lot of crime in it. And he didn't do anything about it until he chose to be a knight. Well, he didn't have to go be a knight. He could have done something about it in a healthy way, not illusionary way, right? Um, and so it's kind of it's like the opposite of Scrooge, I guess, where Scrooge is living very mean-spirited life, right? In turns, but yeah, there's some kind of parallels there. I think it's fascinating to think about these things and take the lessons away that you can. Because yeah, if you go by the song, "Dream the Impossible Dream," which is the one that Motab's done, um, we are to reach for that kind of unreachable star in our lives, because we're not going to be perfect in this life. It's be either for perfect eventually or perfection pending. Two great conference talks, those are the titles of them. And so we're trying to reach for an unreachable star, but the people around us are not unreachable. The work that we can do here and now is not unattainable. Um, we have we have to try. We have to strive. Um, And we really have to try to see reality as it is, but reality as it is not nihilistic. Reality as it is not depressing. Reality as it is teaches us to love God and our neighbor and to put our full faith in Christ. That's reality. Because in reality, miracles happen. In reality, people are healed. In reality, people overcome severe trials and temptations and addictions. And there is triumph and beauty and joy that we can experience.
Um, I do want to highlight in the chat, Jonathan has left a few comments here in the chat. I do want to highlight the last two. He says, you know someone is a disciple of Jesus Christ if they love their neighbors, and you can also know if they are disciples of Satan if they hate their neighbors, especially if they want to kill them. And his next comment, I don't think Charlie Kirk hated anyone. He's been accused of it, but I haven't seen any of it. Is it hate? And here's the question here that I want to pose, not just to you guys, but anybody who might be listening. Is it hate if you tell somebody that you think their actions or opinions are wrong? And maybe this question, I think, can be framed a number of different ways, but it has to do with how do we define things in our discourse, our public discourse. It seems to me that we have some very different definitions for things depending upon where you might fall on the political or social spectrum, and how you think of things may be very different than how someone else thinks of it, that same subject matter. But the question is, if you believe so strongly that someone else is completely wrong to the point that maybe even their ideas and their opinions could be potentially harmful, how do we, and I'm posing this question to us, how do we as Latter-day Saints, as disciples of Christ,
We just lost your audio.
can you hear me now? Okay.
How
Not
do we,
quite
as
sure.
disciples of Christ, and then
Yeah. So how do we as disciples of Christ reach out sort of across those dividing lines and foster that sort of healthy discourse with people that we think are very wrong, maybe even to the point of experiencing or engaging with harmful rhetoric? And how do we build positive, meaningful relationships with these people? Obviously, this is a two-way street. They have to be willing to give and take as well. But if we're going to mourn with those who mourn in times like these, in my mind, that also requires loving your enemy. Um, this is the I don't know that I have a real strong answer beyond just kind of the general things that we've already discussed. But if we're going to mourn with those who mourn, and we're going to be disciples of Christ and reach out to God's children, many of them are going to think and behave very differently than we might, and other members within the church will disagree and act and behave and think differently than we might on a number of different issues. How do we foster meaningful, impactful, um, positive rhetoric, positive growth, and communion with each other? That, I think that's the question. That if we can figure out the answer to that question, and people on all sides of the political spectrum, all sides of the religious spectrum, what have you, were willing to engage in those ideas, um, we would have a much more peaceful country where um, we could engage in ideas, we could respond to ideas and rebut ideas.
Lost you again.
Yeah. Oh, that time he froze. He freeze?
Yeah.
So
there he is.
what are your guys' thoughts? How do we actually do this in a practical real world sense? How do we foster those sort of bridge building endeavors?
From what I've noticed in just going to school, being around people with very different ideas from me, and having to develop my own worldview, uh, and continually have that challenged and make efforts to strengthen it and have it challenged again and stress test my perspectives on things. What I've noticed is, for the most part, people are unaware that they place their political opinions, their moral positioning and worldview as identical to their their entire personal identity. So to question any of it is an existential threat because they are their political position or moral, cultural position. And that puts you in a very fragile and vulnerable place because it's hard to have any sort of conversation that might challenge your ideas because it feels like a challenge to your existence. And we've heard plenty of rhetoric in that vein uh, the past 5, 10 years. The antidote I feel there is that can help neutralize that is actually a quote from one of my all-time favorite comedians, John Cleese, one of the originals to the Monty Python group, where he gave a talk, and maybe he's mentioned this quote more than a few times, but it's always stuck with me since I first heard it, where he says, "We are always serious," speaking of his weird avant-garde absurd comedy sketch group, Monty Python, said, "We're always serious, but never solemn." And he expands that to mean that they were serious about their craft, that they really enjoyed making funny little movies and shows and sketches, and they were serious about it. They were serious about their mission, but they were never solemn. And what he meant was they were never serious about themselves. They were never self-important. They never felt like they were above anything else because of what they were doing. They were committed to the mission, they were committed to their craft, but they didn't take themselves seriously along the way, or at least they didn't try to. Or at least that's what Cleese took away from that whole experience. And so, in that way, I think it's really important for us individually, and again, I'm thinking in a ward family context, that there are people all around us that need actual help that you can actually give them more than listening to your favorite political pundit and getting riled up about the big they that are ruining the country. So I think it comes down to being aware. Do I have this thought or this belief, or does it have me? Am I being possessed by my own perspective? Can I reduce my idea of self-importance? Can I reduce this taking myself so seriously in this particular instance? And can I focus on what's the actual mission here? And if the mission isn't to love God with all our heart, might, mind, and strength, and then to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, then I think you ought to reevaluate what the mission is and what that looks like. So that's where it starts in my mind, that you have to be aware you're probably taking yourself too seriously and you probably aren't as well aligned with the actual mission in life than you think you are.
Yeah, so it starts with you looking inward,
That
taking
was a
some
tagline of my
inventory.
previous podcast. I always signed off with "It starts with you" because it truly does.
There you go. Um, so I feel like we've talked about this for quite a while now. I want to maybe for the last little bit here before we sort of wrap things up, because I think there's a number of things that could be said, and we could go into a number of different directions here. We could certainly talk more about the 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 case of the shooter and what's been going on lately in the news and all sorts of things like that. But I want to kind of maybe step back and look at how Latter-day Saints view the role of suffering and evil in the world, and maybe kind of how we can conceptualize um our response to evil, to suffering, um from a theological perspective, and offer maybe the listener um a little bit of a little bit of information here on kind of how Latter-day Saints think about things like these. I mean, obviously, we live in a world that is, um, it's part of the natural order that things, tragedies do occur. There's natural disasters. Um, there's entropy. Things break down. There's actual evil in the world. People maliciously commit violent acts against one another for various reasons, not just political. Um, so, from a more, I guess, theological perspective, um, let's talk for a moment about what's called theodicy. That is I guess, the sort of philosophical term for the problem of evil and suffering in the world, and how do particularly Christians, generally speaking, deal with the problem of evil, and then maybe how do Latter-day Saints specifically think about the problem of evil and suffering. I have notes, some things that I've written down, but I want to hear from you guys first, maybe any thoughts you might have. And I know, Sam, you spent a good bit of time researching open theism and things related to that. And so maybe you have something to say related to that area, that might make sense for a Latter-day Saint perspective. Um, but Michael, Sam, I want to kind of give the floor to you guys for a minute. Is there anything you want to kind of lay out, any sort of um, groundwork you want to lay out here in terms of what is the problem of evil and suffering, and how do Christians or Latter-day Saints more specifically think about the problem of evil and suffering, and how do we deal with that?
I'll go first because I'm gonna deflect off my personally the why and the how of the problem of evil, and because we
So you're
have to
not
just,
going to answer the
so
question.
I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to answer the second question you had though about what are we supposed to do about it, right? What's the issue at hand really is what can we do? Um, we're taught in by Lehi teaching his sons that we are to be agents that act for ourselves and not to be acted upon. Um, and there's a lot of psychology that is behind that as well. But there's also a lot more scripture behind that and things. But we're to be agents that act and not to be acted upon. And in order to act, we have to keep ourselves in a state of freedom or liberty. And to maintain that state, you have to abide by correct principles of righteousness and the laws that Christ has set forth, the laws of his gospel. And so in the gospel, we have the laws of faith and repentance, which also infers forgiveness as a law. Then we have obedience, sacrifice, the gospel, more fully, I guess, spelled out, but that's faith, repentance, and chastity and consecration. If you can live those things, evil will still happen. And so we go to consider the lilies, right? In that bit with the Sermon on the Mount. Evil is sufficient for the day thereof, right? Christ didn't even try to tell the people exactly why evil. What he tried to tell them was how to overcome evil with the Beatitudes. And that's like, to me, that the Beatitudes are kind of temple text. And I always love to marry Matthew 5 with Matthew 25 with those parables, right? And so to me, while I would love to know why the fall had to create so much evil, I mean, the Lord had to flood the earth at one point. He had to, depending on how you read it, firebomb Sodom and Gomorrah. He has had to order the destruction of cities and nation states because of how rampant the evil had become. He has had to allow absolute impoverishment of many, suffering beyond what we can comprehend, suffering that I've seen in third world places in this world that we will never suffer in this country for no good reason. And the Calvinist response is trash, by the way. They did not just deserve it. They weren't created for that because he hates them. But our response to it is to me is the only thing that truly matters, because we need to be agents that act. So I'm not saying the philosophy of the theodicy and stuff like that is garbage and we shouldn't explore it. I'm just saying for me, it's about how we act. And how we act is going to be defined by the Beatitudes. It's going to be taught in the parables that Christ gave us. It's the Good Samaritan. It's when saw we thee hungry and or naked, and did not clothe thee, feed thee, what have you, right? Or in prison and didn't visit thee. As ye have done it the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And that is both temporal and spiritual. To me, that's both what we do temporally and what we do spiritually by our worship in on the Sabbath day at church and in the temple. And so it's live what you've covenanted to live. And if you haven't covenanted to live it, the best thing you can do is decide that you're going to make those covenants and then live them, because that will give you the liberty to act as a free agent and fulfill the laws in your life that help you to feel that joy, to have the Spirit with you always. And that is the comforter, right? That's the one who teaches and gives you revelation. It's a member of the Godhead whose presence can make any place you stand in holy if you have him with you. And so to me, the important part is, what do we do to act and not be acted upon? And so that's what I wanted to put out first. And I'll let you guys talk more theodicy, but I want to address that and maybe just put that forward, because we could talk all day long, um, especially about things like open theism, Sam, right? And still not really come to a full conclusion, and have a lot of opinion about it. And so I don't know what you guys want to take it, how you guys want to take it forward from there, but I wanted to say that.
Sure. Let me just uh, offer a few different perspectives that you may have felt yourself, maybe a combination of things, or you may have seen uh, people try to put forward as making sense of tragedy. That's really a different way of explaining what theodicy means, is how do we make sense of this? And there's this is roughly in order of popularity, if you could claim to do so, in terms of how do people explain something like Charlie Kirk being assassinated. And so we might refer to a free will theodicy, which is God allows humans free will, and tragically some choose evil. That's an explanation. There's a greater good theodicy where even though that's horrific, God will use what happened for a greater purpose. That's one way to answer it. There's what I think is rather persuasive and intuitive for Latter-day Saints, which is referred to as soul making, which is that suffering and evil shape us and help us grow in compassion, justice, and courage. Now, one might immediately ask, well, how does that help Charlie? Because he was the victim of violence and death. And that can be tough. Although from everything I've seen and everyone celebrating the life that Charlie led, it does seem that he very genuinely loved his savior and lived in such a way that he tried to invite as many people to their savior as he could, which I think is commendable. There's other ways to think about it, and some just appeal to mystery that we can't know why, but God has wisdom that is beyond our own, and there's not much more you can say about it. There's also, you can think of it in terms of contrast, and obviously we do think about opposition in all things. How could we know the pleasure and sweetness of peace and life if we didn't know tragedy and death? Now, when it comes to open theism, uh, typically the first thing people think about when they think about open theism is that the future doesn't exist, so God can't know it, which means there's some level of indeterminacy, that there's no way of knowing how the future would have turned out until it turns into the present. And so we can absolve God of moral responsibility for allowing evil to occur because it didn't exist yet until it happened. Now, I don't particularly find that convincing. There's, it's a whole other topic we
Yeah,
could
we don't
spend a
have to
lot of
get
time on.
yeah, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole if we don't want to.
But
That's
all I bring it up to say, I'll actually answer it in this way. Um, there's for all you choir nerds out there, millennial choir kids, which I wasn't one, I was a band kid, but I had plenty of choir friends. There's a popular choral composer. His name is Eric Whitacre. He has a friend who lost his wife, and in processing uh, his wife battling cancer and succumbing to it about 20 years ago now, He wrote a series of poems, and he asked his friend Eric, a accomplished choral composer, probably one of the most popular ones as far as the world of choral composition goes today. He asked him to set his words to music, and the very first movement, it's stuck with me, and I've listened to it frequently the past 5 years for almost as long as it's been out. And the whole work is called The Sacred Veil. And the first movement is called The Veil Opens. And I'd like to read this short poem to you, these lyrics, as a way of relating how I view, and I think is a heartening and compassionate way to consider the way God ministers to us in tragedy, or in gladness, really. But here it is. The veil opens. Whenever there is birth or death, the sacred veil between the worlds grows thin and opens slightly up, just long enough for love to slip, silent, either in or out, of this our fragile, fleeting world, whence or whither a new home waits, and our beloved ones draw near. In rapt anticipation or in weary gratitude they stand. Our loved ones stand so close, right here, just on the other side of eternity. And so again, that to me, I think of Charlie. I think of perhaps the legions of angels, seen and unseen, ministering to Charlie's widowed wife and his fatherless children. I even consider those trying to reach the perpetrator in his need, and for all of us grieving in our own ways, and related or unrelated to the topic of the stream of what happened last week. But I think, yeah, angels, ministers, seen and unseen, are so close to us in everything we experience, in gladness and in tragedy. And so I think whenever something seems senseless, beyond comprehension, beyond being able to hold the idea that God is in control and God does love us and God does want the cessation of pain and suffering, that you can consider all the different theodicies you want. You can ball them up all together into one great big theodicy. But whatever helps you reach out to him as he's reaching out to you, that's how healing can occur. And as we feel that, we can help others identify it so that they can reach out in the ways that they need to find their healing in Christ.
So my notes here that I wrote earlier before we started the live stream, I wrote some notes on a few different models, and how different Christians sort of work through the problems of evil and suffering. I think for the sake of this stream, and because I think what you guys have just shared are infinitely more important than I think, you know, me going through all my notes here and just talking theology for a moment. I think I do want to offer, by way of comparison, just a few things that I think will provide some insight into where Latter-day Saints maybe where we're coming from and how we think of the problems of evil and suffering in the world. And why I think Latter-day Saints may be uniquely equipped to understand how this all plays a role in the broader plan of salvation, as Latter-day Saints call it. One thing I want to highlight that I think is really important to understand, and again, I hope that the listeners will bear with me as I talk theology for just a moment. I don't want to linger on it, and I don't want this to devolve into a theological discussion necessarily, especially coming from what you guys have just shared. But I want to highlight a couple things that I think will help others kind of see where we're coming from. So generally speaking, in classical theodicies, the classical Christian theodicies, whether Catholic, Protestant, what have you, many Christians will fall in the category of one or a couple different sort of models of how they conceive of the problems of evil and suffering, and how they might deal with it theologically speaking. Augustine was a major figure in early Christianity who had a lot to say about a number of issues, but not the least of which is the problems of evil and suffering. He had a lot to say about the fall and what became known as original sin, and a number of other doctrines and things that kind of arose from those discussions and theologies. Augustine was incredibly well received by many in some of the early centuries of the church, and his ideas are still very prevalent and strong in Christianity today. Augustine proposed in some of his writings and in his thought, and he wasn't alone in this, but Augustine kind of proposed that evil is a sort of privation of the good. Again, we're talking about a theological model in which God creates ex nihilo, that is, out of nothing. So God is the only self-existent being. Everything else he created from nothing. So therefore, everything that he creates is entirely dependent on God for their sustenance of existence. God is entirely omniscient and omnipotent. And in Augustine's view, God permits or allows for evil to occur and for suffering to occur for a greater good. And not just Augustine's view, but the view of a number of other Christian theologians and philosophers throughout history. Because God creates ex nihilo, everything comes from his created power. He is ultimately the primary source of all creation. He's the primary source of all things. And some of us, like Latter-day Saints, for example, would be quick to point out that because God created everything from nothing and everything is therefore completely dependent on God to be sustained, that means that God is in control of evil. God is in control from top to bottom of all things that he has created. He has complete sovereignty over. And if you take this too far to one end of the spectrum, you end up with Calvinism, as Michael alluded to earlier, where God not only is in complete control over all things, including the allowance of evil and suffering in the world, but God may in fact have decreed that such evils and atrocities should occur. He is directly responsible for making things happen the way that they do. He's what's the word I'm looking for? He ordained all things.
Ordained. Yep.
Yeah, he ordained all things. I want to be specific and use that term because that's
Yeah.
a term that Reformed theologians would use.
All of Christian history has been the tightrope of them trying to say God is in control, but he's not morally responsible for sin.
Yeah.
And trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Right. Now, there's a number of different theological models across history and between Christian traditions. So Augustinian thought is not exactly the same as Reformed thought, or Molinism, Plantica. His model is not going to be the same as Augustine's model or the Irenaean model. Process theism is going to be different as defined by figures like Whitehead or Hartshorne versus Augustine and so forth. There are different models. So I don't want to lump everybody together in the Christian world as saying they all believe X. There's a number of different models. I just wanted to point out for a moment some of the broader concepts that you'll find within some of these stronger, more popular models within Christian thought. Augustine, of course, being one of the most prevalent and widely accepted. All of these models, or at least I should say most of these models, regardless of whether the model declares that God ordains for evil and suffering in the world, or rather just simply allows for evil and suffering to occur, but is not directly responsible for ordaining such evils and atrocities in the world. However you want to define that between these different models. One thing that most of these models all have in common is they require a God who creates ex nihilo. Because of that, I wanted to highlight that specifically because that is a point at which Latter-day Saints diverge drastically. Latter-day Saints, and anybody who has followed this channel for any length of time knows that I've talked about this ad nauseum in another number of other videos. This is if you were going to ask me to define the major differences between Latter-day Saint theology and more traditional Christian theology, creation, the mode of creation, that being creation ex nihilo, would be at the top of that list of the top 5 things or whatever that I would say would be the main theological differences between Latter-day Saints and other creedal Christians, be it from whatever denomination they might herald from. And here's why this is so important with regard to this discussion on the problem of evil. Latter-day Saints, looking at models of theodicy across Christian history, are very apt to point out that any way you slice it, it doesn't matter which of these models you look at, any way you slice it, if God is creating humans and matter and all things out of nothing, ultimately, God is responsible for placing human beings in the circumstances in which he creates them. And so the logical inference is there that God holds and bears some responsibility for the evils and atrocities that occur in the world. In Latter-day Saint thought, because God does not create out of nothing, ex nihilo, but rather creates ex materia, that is, that God exists and we exist co-eternally with God. Our spirits are co-eternal with God. We existed prior to this earth even being created. The materials that were used to create this world existed eternally. Matter exists eternally. Energy exists eternally. Because of that, when God creates, he's not creating out of nothing, poofing things into existence, but rather separating and organizing materials to create new things, to make new things. So because of this stark difference, we existed eternally with God. Our spirits did. Our that if you want to call it the essence of who we are, our spirits, our intelligences, whatever, existed eternally with God, and therefore we have always had what Latter-day Saints we call it agency. Our scriptures in the Book of Mormon refer to it as agency. And I see Jonathan in the chat here. Free agency is the key to understanding evil and suffering. Latter-day Saints believe that because we were not created out of nothing, but existed eternally with God, we have always had some degree of agency. That is an eternal sort of gift or principle of our existence. Because of that, as we experience life in this mortal sphere, this temporal sphere, we can abuse that agency and make choices that harm others or harm the environment or what have you. And because this world is a natural world created from natural materials, existing materials, it is subject to decay and entropy and all the other things that come with living in a natural world. God is not therefore inherently the author or he's not entirely responsible. It doesn't bear all responsibility ultimately at the end of the day for the choices that we make with our agency. So that is a key difference between our view and the view of most traditional Christian thought.
Let
go ahead.
Let me connect that real quick back to Charlie. Because
please do.
often in just natural way of grief, people will question, like, why did this have to happen? And yeah, some people will, I guess, depending on the circumstance or depending on the person, they'll appeal to, say, the greater good theodicy idea that, well, yes, it is tragic. That I'm not going against that, but God is powerful such that he can bring about something even greater through this tragedy, which, just as a quick aside, I don't find particularly convincing because you really have to qualify what you mean by that. Otherwise, it makes it sound like God has to have sin in order to bring about the greatest good. that sin is instrumental to bringing about greater goods, when I don't think anyone would actually agree with that. They
Luther
think
Well,
said
that,
it.
and
Martin Luther did say that, by the way, Sam. So let's,
yikes. Okay,
yeah.
well,
Okay.
well, and
So, you know,
and from that perspective, uh, that to me sounds strikingly similar to saying that God ordains evil for His glory.
yeah, right. So
Um, yeah, go ahead.
there is that. And again, maybe that explanation would work better in under different circumstances, but I think, yeah, someone may be stuck in a loop saying like it didn't have to happen that way. It didn't have to happen that way. The perpetrator didn't have to do that. Somebody could have seen him, could have alerted authorities, could have prevented. Like there's so many ways that would have resulted in Charlie still being here with us. And to me, part of what helps really ground your explanation there, Jacob, which we believe in is completely backed up by LDS theology, that agency really is primitive because we are, as individual intelligences and essences, co-eternal with God. We've always been moral agents. And so in that way, it's just a fact of existence that we each are moral agents. That God can then say, in effect, it didn't have to be that way, but it did. But it did. And here's the way forward. And so that to me is sobering, and maybe in the midst of grief that would be unsatisfying, but that ultimately seems to be the actual most productive and trust building and faithful explanation, or at least an expression of it. That, yeah, we can call it the greater good theodicy, but I'm just trying to connect that deeply relational compassion that God has for each of us through the atonement of Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ can perfectly meet us where we are because he took upon us all of our pains and afflictions. And so, no matter how it turns out, there's no situation in which Jesus would have to throw up his hands and say, I don't know what to tell you. He can confidently take any outcome and give you healing. So that's sort of how I'm tying these things together as you're explaining it, Jacob.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing it back because I that was going to be my next point was how does this relate to Charlie and the actual tragedies we experience. Um, so yeah, I appreciate that for connecting that for us. Um, any final thoughts from either of you guys before we wrap up, and then I want to maybe share one last thing before we wrap up.
my final thought would just be kind of regurgitation. It's all about how you choose to act and how are you going to take control of your life. Because free agency is that central, primordial, or primitive part of our existence that is eternal in its nature and which God Himself will not violate. How are you going to take control or act for yourself? And are you going to choose liberty and eternal life or sin and death? And so we could just go right back to Lehi teaching his sons, um, about these different concepts and the purpose of the fall and entering into a world that is full of deprivation and depravity and all manner of wickedness, yet is also full of so much opportunity to learn grace, to experience beauty, to have joy, right? And so the again, we're not always told the why, even though why is such an important question to answer. We're not always told the why. I think we are commanded to experience the why by living the laws of the gospel. And that's the best way, the experiential way to learn and grow and become Christ-like. And that's the point. It's not an intellectual pursuit only. I don't think you can be LDS without intellectual pursuit, but or generally Christian either. I just know that you also can't be very good at it, at least, without that experiential wisdom or knowledge that you gain. And so the point I would just make, what are you going to do about it in terms of following the way, the light, the truth that is Christ? So
Yeah. Um, yeah.
Let me just add in
Go ahead.
closing that if you made it this far, I think it just bears repeating that if you were processing grief related to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, or if you're listening to this and something else is going on, and there's a lot of big, confusing feelings, and it's really disrupting your life right now, remember that it is important to reach out to others for help, for commiseration, for compassion, and for moving forward, just in the little ways that you can to get through the day. And things will improve, moods shift, and that's to be expected. That said, be aware, be, I wouldn't say guarded, but just be aware that there are those out there who would manipulate you to their ends. They would take advantage of your raw feelings to get things that they want. And even if it is someone you trust or a member of a community you feel you belong to, whether it's political or cultural or in your immediate vicinity, it's important, again, to be serious but not solemn. Don't take yourself seriously. Don't be self-important. Be focused on the mission. And the mission, again, in life is to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And whatever prevents you from doing either of those things, it's probably related to pride. And it may not be intuitive, or you may say, Sam, you're being harsh if I'm calling uh, the raw feelings of grief and anger and sadness, calling that pride. What I mean is there's an element, a necessary element of humility that goes on with grief, because otherwise it just turns into ruminating, and rumination turns into resentment and hate, hateful action. And we just saw the consequences of that, and they're tragic. Not to say that all of that inevitably leads to deadly violence, but go crack open the Book of Mormon. Go crack open any scripture. It's always right there in every generation. It's always right there in front of us, just begging for us to give in and see society collapse into violence. We don't need that. We need people who are not self-serious, but rather quite serious about the mission, which is to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Thank you both. I appreciate your guys taking the time to hang out with me and talk about this. As I said at the beginning of the stream, we didn't want to make this a political thing. We didn't want to loom too much on Charlie Kirk's assassination and the news events surrounding that. We wanted to talk more about how do we respond to tragedy and to evil in the world, and how do we reach out to others and kind of lead in a Christ-like way. I hope that's what we accomplished tonight. I think we've had some really good discussion on this. And for anybody who is still listening, it looks like there's quite a few of you still listening in the chat. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate you guys sticking with us tonight. These kinds of tragedies can be heavy, and the questions that they raise don't always have easy answers. But what I think we've done, or at least what we've tried to do, is show that, at least from a Latter-day Saint perspective, God doesn't necessarily cause these evils. Rather, he honors our agency. What is abundantly clear in Latter-day Saint scripture and thought is that God mourns with us. Christ himself, our Savior, entered into our suffering when he took upon himself a mortal frame and dwelt among us. He entered into that suffering to be with us. And that is, to me, the very essence of the gospel of Christ. That a loving father and a loving son would agree that the son would come to earth to experience this thing we call mortality and suffer with us so that he could sit with us in the mire. But that through his atonement, he can pull us out. That's the hope that we hold on to. Evil and death don't get the last word. Christ does. It's because of him that there is a future where every wrong can be made right and every tear will be wiped away and replaced with joy. So I hope that as we leave the discussion tonight, that we remember that our response, how we respond to evil and tragedy, matters. This is a world that's full of anger and division. And we, as Latter-day Saints, as people of faith, need to do everything we can to choose to answer messages of hate and anger with faith and hope and with charity, which is the pure love of Christ. And on that note, thanks everybody for joining tonight. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I hope it was at least helpful in some way, shape, or form. I know it helps me a great deal when I have friends like Sam and Michael that I can, talk to and bounce ideas off of and discuss. So in any case, thank you guys for sticking around. It's been a pleasure. Stay safe, take care of each other, and lead in the Savior's way.